welcome to today's interview. This is part of a new series that we're doing here at the Institute of Masters of Wine, where rather than talk the technical stuff, we're looking at the stories of notable figures in the wine trade. My name is McHale, Master of Wine. I'm the chair of the Institute of Masters of Wine Events Committee, and it is my honor today to be talking once again to Sarah Morphew Stephen MW, who was the first woman in 1970 to become a Master of Wine. So that you have a little bit of context, I will just read you the biography that Sarah has on the Institute of Masters of Wine website. So after studying enology at Bordeaux University, Sarah worked for Harvey's of Bristol, St James's Bonded Warehouse in Bermondsey, Brown and Park at the Stockwell bottling plant, and IDV, where she passed the MW examination to become the first Lady MW. She became wine and spirits buyer for Sam Smith's Brewery before taking over as controller for wines, spirits and beer at Asda Superstores. She moved to London to become marketing director for Stowells of Chelsea at the time of the launch of the 3-litre wine box. After a move to Scotland with her husband, she opened Glasgow's first wine warehouse, the Barrel Selection, which later, due to ill health, developed into an agency supplying wine to the Scottish wholesale trade. In 1997, Sarah retired from the wine trade when she purchased her first Georgian Edinburgh property as offices for conversion to residential use under the BSA property banner. Now, I was fortunate enough to interview Sarah last year for 67 Pall Mall TV, and we have put a link to that interview so that you can watch that. You can also hear a lot about Sarah's story in the wonderful speech that she gave at the celebratory dinner for the 60th anniversary of the Institute of Masters of Wine, and we'll put a link to that as well. So rather than her repeating all of those same stories, I'm going to take a little bit of a different angle today. So of course, Sarah, we know that you were the first woman to become a Master of Wine in 1970, and I would like to touch upon that as we go through our chat today. But the one thing that really struck me when I interviewed you last year for 67 Pall Mall TV, and it was something which they unfortunately didn't have time to include in the finished feature, was your comments about your time as a wine buyer at Asda. I thought that was really fascinating, and I'd love you to tell us a little bit more about that time and what you achieved and where it led you to in your career.
Well, at that time, there were not many female buyers at that sort of level. In fact, I was controller to buy wine, spirit and beer. So I learned an awful lot about beer, for example, that had never been my forte. And it didn't take me long to realize that the wines that were being sold at what you would call an affordable price were really very poor quality. And even now, there are still companies that will bottle virtually anything in the belief that people really don't know what they're drinking and they'll drink anything. And that was something that I found was not true, because if I managed to buy a very drinkable, affordable wine, it would just fly off the shelves and they'd come back for more.
Consumers are not stupid. They know what something tastes like, don't they?
Well, let me tell you a funny story. I was quality control manager for a large company where we had a state-of-the-art warehouse and we had a fully automized tank room. All the wine was moved from tank to tank automatically and so on. And we did have an accident, which was a vat of red Portuguese wine, 3/4 full, was topped up with 1/4 of Cyprus sherry. It was decided, after a lot of debate, that we should bottle this tank of wine off in the blend over a period of a year, or as long as we could keep it safe. Everything went swingingly until we ran out. And then we were flooded with complaints. What has happened to the wonderful, wine that we've been drinking from Portugal. We all love it. It used to be so fruity and it was so wonderful and so easy to drink. And we then had another board meeting to see whether we should continue doing it. But of course, it was against the law, so we didn't.
That's a great story. I love that one. What were the other big trends that you noticed around that time with bringing, quality wine into the UK market?
It was always interesting. There were people, I think the important thing, and this is where Australia scored, was because remember that it was after that we started importing Australian wine big time. And there were two aspects of that made it special. One was that the blends were reliable. Reliability is a fundamental need in a wine buyer because they want to know that if the bottle they had last week, they open another one the same the next week, it's going to be the same. Terribly important. And I think also the fact that they had names you could say. At that point, you had the Germans still giving sort of 5 names in German in that terrible German script that nobody could read, and they didn't sell for that very reason. However, when something like Bin 65 came out or a name like that, it flew off the shelves. So I think those were two very fundamental things that were needed. The reliability factor being the most important.
Yeah, and I think when I myself as a teacher of wine, I'm talking to students about the history of wine in the UK market over the last few decades. Something I always comment on is the growth of Australian wine in this market, and I find it fascinating that you lived through this time and you had a huge impact on that very trend. And exactly as you say, consumers love the consistency, the reliability, the pronounceability, and it's had an enormous impact on the trajectory of wine in the UK ever since, and indeed on how old world countries have needed to compete. Yes. Would you say that it has also shifted the way wine is made in European countries?
Yeah. Do you remember years ago, well, you're probably far too young, do you remember when you had a glass of wine in the pub? It was virtually undrinkable. It was usually very, very poor quality Italian or French. And frankly, it was something you made your tongue curl. It was so bad. And what Australia did was it took a long time though, a much longer time than you'd think for the wine buyers like publicans and restaurateurs to accept that Australian wine would be acceptable. Now it's quite interesting because for example, our lovely pub here in the village. Now I would say that at least half, if not more, of the wine list is New World. And that says everything, doesn't it? And also the Europeans have picked themselves up because they used to say, oh, well, my grandfather made the wine this way and we'll continue doing it. And it was awful. And I can remember taking samples of New World wine out to France and showing them to friends of mine and saying, this is what you need to do. But they took no notice. Not until they discovered that New Zealand, for example, in Bordeaux, white Bordeaux, Sauvignon Blanc from Bordeaux, was lean, mean, and fairly no fruit, dreadful. And then you take, as I did, a really good New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, and they would look at it and say, oh, yes, 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 but they wouldn't do anything. But eventually they had to and there was that amazing time in the early 2000s that sales of New World wine overtook the sales of France, for example, as the biggest producer, which was really, really worthwhile.
Yeah, I think that was a sort of a very important moment for them in realizing that things needed to change. And certainly my experience now is that many European wine producers are incredibly dynamic and innovative in the way they make wine, and they travel to the Southern Hemisphere and they learn from their colleagues there. And so I'm really pleased, and I love the fact that you had a hand in that.
It also has to be remembered that for many years, there were up to sort of 25 qualified enologists coming out of Roseworthy in Australia, and they had to find a job, and they came to Europe. And at first, they had a really tough time because the French, the Italians, and so on didn't want to change. They were very reluctant to change. They were, very much in their own world. And it was interesting. Later on, I actually went to make wine in South America because I knew it was no good going to France and getting them to change their ways. But I could go out to Chile, for example, and make the wine myself at a low price, but still good. And now we're in a situation where there is no excuse for bad wine, none whatsoever.
So I'm curious to know, Sarah, what was it that led you from working for ASDA to making wine?
It was because I joined a company called Food Brands, and we imported a lot of wine from South America. And I realized that I had an opportunity to fill a gap in the market. And that gap in the market was really good table wine at an affordable price.
So you headed out there, and how was it? What was that experience like?
It was like they put me into a sort of, I don't know what you call it, a hotel annex. And it rained so, because of course you're always there at unpleasant times of the year. You're not there in summer, you're there in the winter doing everything awful. And I used to have to put my white wellies on to go out, get out of the room, because there was so much water outside the door. And my only hot water was a tiny weeny geyser on the wall. And it was really very uncomfortable. But
winter.
Yeah.
Was this during the winter, is that right?
Often, yes. It was, put it this way, I didn't go there during the times of holidays.
And what kind of wine, were you making in South America?
Well, we made particularly white, because the market for white was bigger. Now it's surprisingly that the market for red wine is really lifting. A huge number of people, and young people seem to be, now that wine is comfortable to drink, red wine in particular, far more young people are drinking red than I imagined. And that is quite a change. And rosé has suddenly hit, because they suddenly kind of feel it's grown up. Also to say that rosé in the early days, now the winemakers make it good, but in the early days, rosé was the difficult thing to buy for a company like ASDA, because it, generally speaking, was under the lights at the top of the fixture. And of course, as you know, rosé does not like a lot of heat and light. And so it would turn brown very quickly. And this is something that they've managed to stop. And now there are, you can have a whole set of rosé wines, and they move sufficiently quickly that you don't have that problem.
As you have commented to me when we've been chatting, winemaking is certainly not as glamorous a job as it seems. Do you have any good stories from your time making wine that you can share with us?
Well, that was always, that's never particularly, if you go to any vineyard during the vintage, you'll see what they actually have to do, and they're usually covered from head to foot in wine in some form or another. I think the early days of that were because it didn't take me long to realize that as a woman, I would need to enter the trade through the technical side, through the enology and through winemaking, because that I was accepted there as a woman. And I, for example, while all my school friends were having a wonderful time and they were working for sort of frightfully posh galleries in Bond Street and doing all sorts of frightfully smart jobs, I was in a white coat and boots, clambering on top of a saffron tank, tasting it to see whether I was going to accept it or not. There was no glamour there whatsoever. And also, the bottling lines, and we used to do things in those days. Much more was bottled in the UK. For example, at the bonded warehouse that I was in, we bottled for the Wine Society, which is unheard of now. And for example, crusted port, we used to bring the port in, and it already had an element of gelatin in it to make the crust firm. But if the staff stopped for a coffee break, we would have to put the bung back in the cask, in the port type, and roll it down the warehouse and back again to make sure that it was all sufficiently stirred up.
That sounds like a very sophisticated method.
Well, I don't think it was. Well, we had some. There was a time when empty bottles came in with just a little foil cap on the top to stop dust getting into them. And we couldn't understand why the girls on the bottling line were getting drunker and drunker every day, until we discovered that they were putting with these little caps on the bottling line, filling them with gin, and it was being passed down the bottling line in these little foil caps.
Cheeky.
Yes.
Not sure anyone would get away with that these days, would they?
Probably not. It was much more primitive, I promise you.
You've mentioned Portugal and port a fair amount. So can you tell me a little bit more about your specific involvement with the wines of Portugal and port?
From the time that I was a student there, I've always been in love with Portugal, with Porto and the Douro. It has been as I said the other day in the speech, it was my soul in the wine trade. And I think that now that Tawny Port is as well regarded as it is, people are beginning to come back to drinking it. The French, as you know, drink it as an aperitif. The Portuguese are trying to make it trendy by using white port with tonic, which I think is okay, but you get that nasty quinine thing at the back, which is not very exciting, I don't think. But the fascinating thing, and I mean, I happen to have a house there too in the Alentejo. My son lives in it now, but I speak Portuguese, and I have been so fascinated with in particular, the red wines that they're making in the Douro Valley. They are superb. And now many of them are beginning to join the ranks of the iconic reds like Sassicaia, Tignanello, Vega Sicilia, these wines, Chateau Mazan, because one or two of them are so good. And the most interesting thing I found was that Touriga Nacional, which is their main grape type, has this ability to age more slowly. Doesn't mean to say that it's not drinkable when it's young, it is, but it also is very, very slow in losing its fruit. For example, I would be given a lovely red wine, and I would expect it to be 2018, something like that. And they say, no, 2011. It had that much fruit left. Amazing. And so, and they're wondering, for example, I was with the Portuguese wine firm of Ramos Pinto, and their Tawny for me is just, but you take this one here, this is fascinating. This is Touriga Chá, a quinta belonging to the original big winemaker of Ramos Pinto, and now it belongs to his son George. It is a small vineyard. They've decided that they're going to make it an iconic wine, and it sells for 80 euros a bottle now, which is, as off the shelf from day one. It's amazing, and it will fetch more. And I think this extraordinary lasting power of the fruit means that we're going to see more and more wonderful wines from the Douro Valley, and lots more wine from the Touriga grape. And that certainly all these companies are now making table wine. They're not allowed, they're not allowed to make table wine below a certain height. You know that the Douro Valley has a strata in the middle, not too low near the river, not too high uphill. And that strata is where you're allowed to make port. You're only allowed to make table wine outside that band.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why a number of different quintas have now moved to the Douro Superior, as they call it, the top, right up near the Spanish border, because it's outside this strictly banded area. And they can make wonderful, wonderful table wine. You know, Quinta de Overmora, Duras Quintas, all of these places, Quinta de Xisto, which is Xisto, they're making phenomenal wine. And it is really going to, I think we need to watch this space.
Excellent. Well, I definitely will. You've inspired me to look out for those. And I believe you were recently honoured in Portugal. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what services that was for?
Well, the Confraria de Vinho de Porto is like the Chevalier de Tastevin. It is a brotherhood of the makers of port wine. I was first given the gong, which is a sort of thing which I suppose I should show you, in 1987. And so this time they couldn't give it to me again. So they elevated me to a much higher rank, where only the Chancellor was allowed to give me the award, and, you know, big red coat and a black hat, emulating Henry the Navigator. That was the idea. So, you know, we're all mini Henry the Navigators, and it was fantastic, absolutely. And I was very, very proud. And apparently the committee decided unanimously that I should be awarded it. So wasn't that wonderful?
Congratulations, Sarah. So Sarah, I'm really fascinated to know a little bit about your early life and what sort of led you to develop a passion for wine and end up making it your career. Were your parents wine lovers?
Not at all. They were complete philistines, though my mother did have good taste. But when I was 11, I had TB, and my mother took me to the island of Madeira for 2 months to stay as a rescuer. And I made wine for the very first time in a friend's quinta down in Madeira. And I was so fascinated by the whole process, and the family allowed me to follow it through, that I was determined that I was going to have something to do with it. And at school, would you believe I collected wine labels? Now in a convent, that's quite something. Wow. I always had this, you know, complete, and I read everything I could. But in those days, there was very little good literature on wine. You know, there was people like André Simon, who, frankly, was, I mean, and the first technical book, well-written book, was actually Julian Jeff's Sherry. And it wasn't really until Jancis wrote the first dictionary, you know, that really a proper wine book was published.
Yeah, and we tend to take that for granted, I think, don't we?
Yes, exactly. Yes, the Atlas of Wine was a triumph. It was after I took the exam. The only thing we had before the exam was David Peppercorn's Bordeaux, which sadly he's never updated. I wish he had, but he hasn't, and that was very helpful.
You've had such an amazing career, and I know we're not going to go into huge detail on the fact that you were the first lady master of wine, because as we said at the beginning, viewers are very welcome to catch up on your speech and on the interview that I did with you last year. But I'd love you to touch upon, you know, how you have seen being a woman in the world of wine evolve over the decades of your career. Is there anything that you think is really markedly different now from when you first joined the IMW?
I was not a buyer when I was with Gilbey's when I passed the Master of Wine, but I suppose I was one of the, if not the first, brewery wine buyer, which was different, very different, and they were all a bit curious as to what that would be like, and then I went on to Asda. Nowadays, it's totally accepted. If you look at any of the big supermarket groups, you'll find that there are several women in the buying department, not just one. And interestingly, my initial training was in the Porto with Ramesh Pinto, and I was taken on as a gamble, because the then technical director, José Antonio, wanted to see whether a woman could be trained to taste and blend as well as a man. It's interesting to see that now, for the last 30 years, their chief technician, blender for all the port wine that Ramesh Pinto make is a woman. It's his niece. It's his niece called Anna Rosas, and she is fantastic. I was so happy to spend time with her because I could feel the way she thought and the way she planned was so marvelous. So I think one has to say they are totally accepted.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Yes.
And we have an equal number of men and women studying to become masters of wine. So it's great progress.
And do you find that they are technical, or are they journalistic, or what are they?
There's a very broad group, and I think we said when we were chatting earlier that in your time it was very much limited to those from a sort of technical background, and now we have a very broad range of consultants, writers, winemakers, yes, educators, yes, studying.
Yeah, that's good. Wonderful.
And one little story that I'd love you to retell, if you don't mind, is how you were coached by the late great McHale MW when you became the first woman to enter the institute. I love that story.
I remember.
I'd love you to tell us that today.
I just heard the news that I'd passed, and the phone rang in my office, and Michael Broadbent was chairman at that time of the institute, and he then spent 20 minutes on the phone telling me how to treat the other MWs and how to treat the press, which was hilarious. I had always intended anyway to play very low profile with the other members of the institute, because it was tough on them suddenly having a woman bursting into their male domain. So I just took it very quietly, and I'm happy to say it was lovely.
And did you keep wearing perfume? I seem to remember there was an anecdote about perfume.
Yes, but I think there's perfume and perfume. You know, and there are some that are very, very invasive, and I think you can't do that. But you know, I wear perfume, but not if I'm going to do a very serious tasting or judging, for example. I don't use it then.
So Sarah, if you had to say, what is perhaps the most important skill that you developed during your time as a wine buyer, a wine judge, what would you say it was?
Definitely the ability to use the nose. The nose is I think, and I believe, somebody told me when I was studying for the MW that you ought to have 90% of the answer before you ever tasted it. And I would agree with that entirely. You can go through, and I used to be known as the bloodhound at home, because I could always, you know, if my son had picked up a cigarette and he thought that he'd been so clever in getting rid of it, I'd say, where you been spending?
No chance at all of hiding that.
Absolutely. They couldn't get away with anything, I'm afraid. No, definitely nose is absolutely, if you have nasal problems, then it doesn't really work.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's been such a pleasure to speak to you once again, Sarah. I'm sure our listeners and our viewers will have questions that they would love to ask you. So of course we will let you know what questions arise from today's chat. But thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to connect with you again. And
it's been lovely to see you. Lovely to see you, and you're doing a wonderful job. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure.